Welcome back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. On this episode, I speak with veteran and clinical psychologist, Dr. John Whelan. John was born and raised in Newfoundland and was the oldest of 9 children. He had to grow up fast as the eldest child and protector of his younger siblings. He left home after high school, joined the Navy, and spent almost a decade in uniform. As a lifelong learner with a curious mind, John started his post-secondary education and hasn't stopped since. He has a PhD in clinical psychology focused on the effectiveness of addiction treatment programs. John has dedicated much of his time to helping veterans deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. He is part of the team that runs Camp Aftermath with fellow Northern Sentinel Farid Yaghini. John is passionate about helping veterans and honest about the ways in which military leaders have failed in their responsibilities to their people. Thanks for supporting the show, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with John Whelan. John, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Chris. Thank you.
Where are you calling in from?
I'm from Halifax right now, waiting for our newest storm to arrive. Yeah, just outside Halifax.
Yeah, I think we're eating it right now, so or at least a part of it. But you know, my maritime experience had me out in the snowblower this morning to get ahead of it and just to sort of keep it chopped down to a manageable level, which is my learning from living in Gagetown.
Oh, nice.
Got to stay ahead of it.
Yes,
you know,
for sure.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you joining us today, and our connection is through one of the other Northern Sentinels, through Farid Yaghini.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm so glad that he connected us, because I think although we've had different conversations about mental health, veterans, and how all those pieces fit together with former serving members, soldiers, I don't think we've had the opportunity. I haven't had the chance to talk to a medical professional specifically on this. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that after we get to the origin story first, about where your family came from, where you grew up, what your youth was like. So maybe let's just start with some family origin story about where your family is originally from, both sides, mom and dad's.
Yeah, so that's a good place to start. It all starts in Ireland, and
Okay.
my wife took me to Ireland actually on my 60th birthday, and so my father's family is from Waterford area, and my mom, Murphy, of course, another good Irish name, is from County Clare. So the history that I was able to track, they came to Newfoundland in the late 1800s, and I'm assuming around the potato famines. They ended up in Newfoundland. So a lot of fishing, lumbering, mining. My dad was a miner for 16 years. Matter of fact, when I was born, he was still mining on Bell Island, which is just off of St. John's. And so that was my earliest memories. Of course, we're driving up to the mines, the iron ore mines, with Dad as a 5 and 6 year old, right? Of course, when the mines closed, that changed our life considerably. I mean, all the displaced miners, many of them moved to Ontario, into the States, and just left Newfoundland because of lack of work. So for us, that was a major change, with Dad trying to find work, whatever he could at the time. And Mom, of course, was, I'm the oldest of 9 kids, so we have our own tribe, right?
Yeah.
So of course, Mom was really always busy cooking, cleaning, just looking after the kids. So I was, of course, schooled in a Catholic school. Ended up in high school under the Jesuits, and that'll lead into my foray into St. Mary's University later in life with the Jesuits and Loyola. But before that, as a teenager, I worked with my dad in construction. He ended up being a construction blaster. So as a teenager, I got to see a lot of things go boom, big time. So that was a whole learning curve. I think what I learned out of that from my dad and from that whole community was the the importance of hard work. Hard work, in its own right. And so in school, I was a good student. I loved school, loved the structure of it. I was one of those kids who, what? I learned to scrap. for,
Okay.
I learned to be a scrapper, not because I'm that kind of personality, but out of defense. But I was also a kid that was quite smart in school, so I had the other folks who were my friends because I could help them with their grades. So I learned this early on, this kind of dual personality, right, of doing what was necessary.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of interesting things in there for me. So I'm curious. Uh, so when the mines closed, do you remember what the sort of impact, not just on the family, but the community was?
Yeah, the community of Bell Island, it had thousands of miners and their families, and all mostly company housing. So, as anywhere in Canada, when mining towns closed, uh, they were just displaced. I mean, we were literally packed up in a big moving truck with all of our house belongings and moved off the island within one day. I remember
Oh,
being in this huge vehicle with mom and my younger siblings at the time. I would have been 6 or 7ish, so I still have memory of it. And just this ride to this new place, this new house, never been there, brand new community, didn't know anybody, didn't just no idea at all where we were going. And that was typical of of many of the families.
So did all the families get moved sort of back onto the main island? Or were they sort of dispersed? Like you mentioned, a bunch went down to the U.S. or.
Yeah, a lot ended up. A lot of my first degree relatives ended up in Ontario. At that time, a lot of the manufacturing and canning plants and those kinds of things, and so yeah, um, and some stayed. I mean, some stayed on the island and just survived in other ways, mostly fishing. Yeah.
Hmm. Do you remember how that sort of like impacted you? Were you old enough to understand what was going on, or was it the sort of the kids just roll with it sort of effect?
Uh, Part of it was kind of like this is new, it's interesting. What I experienced right away were my close friends, my childhood friends were gone. And
Hmm.
so, as the oldest, as a kid, I was kind of, I remember being, I was small for my age. Um, and in the new communities we ended up in, we weren't welcome because they saw us as mining families is coming and taking the jobs from their parents. So
Right.
when I mentioned the scrapping, so I was picked on as a kid. Spent a lot of time just trying to avoid situations. I was pretty quiet and just not aggressive or anything like that. But it got to a point where it was just unavoidable, right?
Yeah, of course. So, one of the other things that jumped out at me, because I'm ignorant of the Jesuits, but I often hear about the Jesuits and or the relationship to education and schooling. Can you maybe explain a little bit about um, maybe why the Jesuits were so involved in education? Because this is not an uncommon theme I've heard from people.
Yeah. So in Newfoundland, the Catholic. So there were two sects that I experienced. One were the Christian Brothers. They were a tough lot. These guys these guys were pretty aggressive, like with discipline and things like that. So my first part of high school, the way St. John's was structured at the time, was with the Christian Brothers, and it was not unusual for corporal punishment for me, to be going to a washroom and see some young kid getting a punch in the face, just because he was
Right.
whatever being disruptive in the classroom. So for me, going to the then Gonzaga, of course, with the Jesuit, uh, I just saw them. They were disciplined men, but they were intelligent men. They were, and I said this in a recent kind of interview I had. What I learned from them, they were principled men. I mean, they were a presence, but they weren't aggressive. They weren't over demanding. They weren't critical. They were just, I think they really took on their role as guiding and helping developing young men because it was a male school, right?
This is at Gonzaga?
Gonzaga, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Which is where is that in the U.S.?
So this is still Canada. This was still
okay.
In St. John's. It's still there. It's changed over the years. More lay teachers, and I think it's co-ed. It shifted to co-ed afterward. Yeah.
Okay. Were you able to? I mean, this must be with hindsight, where you look at them as principled men, but certainly as a young man, seeing somebody getting punched in the face for something, it must have been difficult to sort of reconcile a principled person from maybe somebody who is maybe less reasonable, less controlled.
Yeah, though, two separate groups. So the Christian Brothers were in one school. It was in grade 9. And so when I shifted to grade 10, then I shifted to a new school, and that was the Jesuits. So they were a welcome relief. Right?
Gotcha.
There were no boxing matches in the hallways.
Yeah, welcome relief, I have no doubt.
Yes.
No doubt at all. So you said, John, that you kind of kept to yourself. You enjoyed school. If you weren't, so you're the oldest of 9. I mean, I'm wondering what that sort of responsibility looks like, because your mom's running a household, and it very much is. I mean, I've always used the language about working outside the home, because anybody who's run a household, even for a short period of time, knows how much work it is. It's a full-time job and then some. So what was your responsibility as the eldest in the family?
Now, that's a big question. 2 roles: protect my younger sisters, because there was myself, and then there's 3 or 4 sisters after me. So the message from my father was, my job is to protect them on school grounds. And that meant having to physically defend them. And I took that on. At home, my job was to be mom's helper, discipline, things like that, and also to be her confidant and her protector, because my dad was a drinker. And with the drinking came some pretty bizarre behavior. So as a teenager, I had a lot of responsibility at home to be the one to stand up.
As you sort of got to the end of high school, did those responsibilities make you feel like you needed to stay, or did those responsibilities, you were looking for a welcome relief from them to go away from home?
The latter.
Yeah.
There was no room for me in that whole situation. In the community I was in, I stood out because I was intellectually curious. I wasn't the kind of typical just run around, have fights, and just be content with a labor job for the rest of my life. The responsibilities at home, it was just there was no room. So for me, I needed a way out.
Did you have a sense what that was going to be as you were getting older in high school?
No, I didn't. The worst day of my life is when high school ended, because it was over, and I hadn't thought about what's next, because it just hadn't. Because I had taken in the structure of school and learning and the environment and my friends. So I tried college for about 7 months. Just couldn't get back and forth to school, really, because we lived so far away that there was no public transportation. I didn't have a vehicle. Like I'm 17 years old, right? And so tried it for 6-7 months and had to end college. It would have been a good go. I mean, being an electronics technologist at the time, I mean, that was a forerunner to all of the computer development and things like that that occurred decades later, right?
So college didn't work out. So was that the sort of the catalyst for you did you leave Newfoundland?
Well, I left Newfoundland. Yeah. So my dad's brother my Uncle George. I spent a lot of time with him as a teenager, and he was Royal Navy. That was before Canada joined Newfoundland, so he was Royal Navy, World War II. So I spent time talking with him. So that was my only exposure to anything outside of Newfoundland, other possibilities. So then I had heard of one fellow, not many had joined the military around our neighborhoods when I was a kid, but one guy I knew had joined the military. So I didn't want construction jobs. College wasn't feasible. So I found myself down at CF Recruiting in 1977.
Yeah. It's, I mean, there's the demographics of the podcast is most people listening are old enough to know that when you're talking about being sort of isolated and it's relatively insular, it's because there's no internet, because your research, if you were interested in something, you had to go to the library and hope that they had something in the library there. So it wasn't a lack of want, and as you'd already said, you're intellectually curious. It's just the information wasn't available. So you're dealing with so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
So how'd the recruiting center how'd that turn out?
It turned out. How did it turn out? So I remember talking with this guy. So I did the aptitude testing and things like that, and so I was open to any trade in the military. This guy said, how would you like this, element, that element? So somehow he convinced me that the Navy was the way to go. And I found out later on he was a warrant officer. Oh, wait, he was a P1 in the Navy. I ended up seeing him on a ship like years later. It's like, you lied to me. It's the old typical, have I got a trade for you? We will build on your electronics. And I said, okay, sure. I have an aptitude for that kind of stuff, math and all that kind of jazz. So I ended up choosing Navy and just waited for my, my joining instructions and yeah.
So what was the transition like from Newfoundland to the Canadian Armed Forces?
Wow. It was, I ended up in Cornwallis, and it was like, so, I'm the generation, like we're dabbling with marijuana, and I've got long hair, the whole typical thing. I ended up in Cornwallis, and it's like, oh shit, I've just gone back to the 1950s, right? How did I end up here, right? So I end up in Cornwallis. We get off the bus. Of course, everybody's screaming at us. They huddle us into a little MP shack, and there's a garbage can in the middle of the room. And I'm looking around going, okay, what? So this guy barks at us, right? Whatever you have on your person or in your pocket goes in that garbage can. And he walks out. And I'm going, okay, I don't have anything. And all I hear was glink, dink, bang, knives, brass knuckles, bottles, pill bottles. I'm going, oh man, this is like the cuckoo's nest. Like, okay, where am I? Right? Where am I? That was my first impression, is where am I? Yeah.
And so that's a great lead into. So what were the sort of the backgrounds of the demographics of the people who were at basic training in Cornwallis with you?
So from across Canada, a lot from Ontario. I remember that. Some Western kids, like from the prairies. Few from the Maritimes, but not really. Not in the platoon I was in. Like we started with 120. A lot of it was Quebec as well. So this is my first exposure really to Canadians from across the country, right? And and just all different personalities, all different types of people, right?
Yeah, and so you obviously don't get a lot of exposure, right? It's basic training, so you're doing probably a lot more Army type stuff, I assume, than
there was
probably anticipated.
No, I had PPCLI, a couple of RCRs. My instructor was a dragoon, and this was hard Army training. There was no doubt. There was Navy. What Navy, right?
Yeah. So was it a bit of a relief when you got to your first sort of round of naval training?
So here's the deal, Chris. I loved the drill and the discipline uh, of Cornwallis. I mean, I'm anxious all the time. Don't want to be sent home, but I did really well with it. I was running up for the commandant's shield. So when I hit Halifax and Navy base, I was disappointed, right, in the
Mm.
lack of decorum, the lack of discipline, the lack of those things. So that was the first thought I had. Was like, oh man, this is a bit of a letdown, right? Which coming from Cornwallis, yeah. The one thing that stood out for me, and I remember going home, there was something I knew I was changed as a person, right? Uh, and that kind of developed over time, but something in me had fundamentally changed. And I think it was around self reliance. Too much, well, I ended up being too much self reliance, but I learned that I could really push through. Right? People talk about push through. I learned that firsthand, like push through and reach another level of who I was as a person.
You've referred a couple of times already, John, to um, so schooling structure, Jesuits structure, Cornwallis
Yeah,
structure.
yeah.
What was the what was then reflecting back? What was the draw? Why did you, whether it be crave, enjoy? I won't put words in your mouth, but why was that something that clearly, even at the earliest stages, was important to you?
When I look back over like the disruptions of us having to move as a kid, never knowing what to expect of my dad's behavior, could be a wonderful man to work with, and this extremely dangerous and chaotic person when he drank. Being in a community where there was a lot of chaos, there was a lot of violence around me, um, and always having to rely only on myself to kind of structure myself, right? Uh, and then having something external that I could rely on as a structure. Uh, I what's the word? I didn't even think about it. I just shone in that within structure, right?
Hmm.
Where the rules are, what I'm capable of doing, what is expected, what is not expected, right? So within that, I was able to really kind of blossom, I think, and grow into a man. Like I joined as just a 20-year-old, right? Uh, having all this other stuff that had been put on me as responsibilities, and now I'm in this environment where I don't have to be uh, always looking over my shoulder, wondering what's the next level of chaos to occur.
How long did you spend in the Navy?
I did about 9 years, and you know, I did as most of us did as kids, young fellas. I drank, ran around, got in fights. All, 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 all in camaraderie here, there, and everywhere overseas and in Canada. But I was also deemed a fast tracker, right? I mean, I was a corporal at that time, a corporal with less than 3 years, no prior military service. So I did well on almost everything they threw at me. So, um, I packed into drinking. That was just I didn't want to go down that road. And I wanted to really show the military what I could do. And, and when because my trade at the time, my MOC was dying. It was electronic warfare, and that was being phased out just because we didn't have the equipment and couldn't keep up. So I wanted a bigger challenge. So I wanted to go to university. And I remember meeting with the PSO, and he said, well, you've got too much time in. I only had a little over 4 years in at the time. And I remember him saying to me, and you're not a fair-haired golden boy from Ontario. And he looked at me and said, by the way, this conversation will never be repeated. I have 2.5 of these on my shoulder. You have 2 of those on your shoulder. Well, I went right back to my chief and blah, 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 right? So here's what I had to do. This is bizarre, right? So I took the PSO's advice. He said, if you want to go to university, get out, go. So I said, okay, how can I make this work? So I had to break my time. So I had to actually transfer to the reserves so I could go to St. Mary's, which I did, to the Yale University Dean's List, $1,000 scholarship, back to recruiting to shift out of reserves back to Reg Force. And oh man, how many times have we heard this? Recruiting said, have we got a deal for you? Right? We'll bring you back your old trade, your own rank. It's just for an administrative purpose, but you'll be going to university. And this was in August of 82 at the time, 82 or so. And he said, go back to Stadacona, wait for your posting message university. You'll do your officer training in summer. So I said, great. Hey, sign me up. This is what did me in. It's a Friday afternoon. I got a message posting immediately to HMCS Annapolis under sailing orders. And I went, what?
Is that West Coast?
No, East Coast. Before she went West Coast, posted me back to sea. And I went, okay, this is a mistake, right? So tried to do what I could. Couldn't do anything. Showed up on the ship Monday morning. The ship is under sailing orders to sail that morning. They were going to charge me with being out of uniform and not being prepared to sail. I'm going, I got the message 5 minutes ago, man, right? So it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You should have known, right? So I tried everything. Went through my divisional officers, education officer, and my DO laughed at me and said, "Yeah, you got screwed." And I, what do you mean? He goes, you ain't going nowhere, right? And what turned out for me that was a dark spot. That because what they'd got me on there at that point was a 3-year fixed contract, no way out. And the military was doing that in the 80s, so there was no way out. And what turned for me into loyalty, absolute love for the military, I despised them. I was very depressed. I had to dig up anger so I wouldn't hurt myself. I wouldn't just, disappear over the side of the ship at night. That's how dark it was. I remember an XO on one of the ships. He looked at me. I was his communication number, like for different evolutions, like refueling and all that kind of stuff. And I remember him looking at me. He said, "Whelan," he goes, "you don't have to hate us so much." And I remember, and I'm still emotional when I think about this. I said, inside I'm going, of course I have to hate you because that's all I have, right? Because if you take that, I'm done. Yeah, it was brutal, right? It really was. So when I left the military, I and headed back to St. Mary's on my own. I knew I had to put something between me and the military. I had to be something different. And for years, right, before I did graduate training or anything like that, to me, the military was, whenever I thought about it, it was like a black spot, and I'd get, a black hole in my head, and I just didn't want to think about it, right? I'm in university, and I'm just lost, right? But I did what the military taught me: self-discipline, focus, do what you're here to do, get out of here. You don't have anything in common with these folks, and that's what I did in my undergraduate, right? Just head down. I was married, so my wife's support, that was the main thing. Most of my friends, they were all military anyway. Of course, they're all still sailing. They're all deploying, and so I never saw them anyway, right? Even my closest friends.
Betrayal of trust like that's incredibly powerful.
Oh man, they could have just taken me on the parade square and shot me. That's what it felt like, right?
I don't think I don't think people understand that the impacts of that sort of betrayal of trust, and I'm sure we'll get into this more later, can have on people. And this isn't just the military, but certainly I think that social contract, whether people are conscious or unconscious of it, when that's violated in whatever way they see that social contract, it is deeply impactful. Yeah, there's no doubt. What did you go to? What did you go to school for? What did you go to university for?
I initially was going to school for law, and I remember one of my.
It's an interesting twist.
It's an interesting twist. I'd had enough of electronics, thanks. And to be fair to the Navy, they gave me every course like to keep me happy during that 3-year period. Like I ended up on a tech course, on my leadership courses, this course, that course. I was trained to repair computers under a microscope at sea if we needed to. That level of training, right? And I walked away, never going to use that. So university, first it was criminology certificate. That was my first kind of thing I wanted to complete. So I finished those courses, considered criminal law. And I remember one of my profs, he took me aside and he said, Whelan, he goes, you got to have the grades. He goes, but we need to have a conversation. And I said, yes. He said, you have too much, I forget his exact words, a too well-developed sense of right and wrong. He goes, you'll never survive law. And I'm going, hold on here. And now that years later, I thought about it and I'm going, yeah, what he was telling me was too rigid, right?
It's great advice.
Great advice.
It is.
No law.
Right? Yeah. I would hope that somebody who was looking to get into politics, if they had a similar philosophy, would be sort of waved off of saying, you know what, this is not your calling.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't going to be the legal profession.
Nope. So I like the sciences. So for a fleeting moment, it was I knew I wanted to help people, and I had no idea what that meant, right? To be involved with people, because I'm, have been, still am, a bit of a social butterfly. I'm energized around people, so I love that aspect of life. So I ended up moving into towards psychology because I had enough science to kind of tweak that, the statistics and all of that element was met, but also learning formal ways of going about helping people. I had already done some coursing through the community colleges. Like stepping back, as I'm doing my undergraduate work, I'm also running a halfway house for addictions in Halifax.
Okay.
As the first house manager. It was just a fledgling thing at the time, and now over 40 years later, it's still going strong. So I was doing that as I was doing my undergraduate, right? So then the lead in then to formalizing it, going down the road of psychology just made sense to me, and it was one of those things that I discussed with my wife. Was I ended up with doing a PhD ultimately. But it was basically 1 degree at a time and see where this goes. That's basically how it went.
So how did you get connected with the halfway house?
So it was one of those things that I was, when I left the military, of course, at that time it was called Canada Manpower. Now it's Service Canada. And I remember showing up and spending hours with them trying to explain to them what I did in the military. And they just, there was no way they could align me with any job because it didn't fit anywhere, right? Nobody wanted their missile control systems fixed. Why not, right?
That's right.
Right. So that was frustrating. So I ended up answering an ad in the paper. They needed a night shift attendant. So it first started off, I would do 2 12-hour shifts I was used to standing watches on a Friday night and a Saturday night, right? Looking after the facility and the residents who were there, if they were up and upset, I'd talk to them, things like that. So, and that quickly morphed into basically, another job. I got a job pretty quickly as the house manager when they replaced the one that was there, and I stayed there for a few years, even as I'm finishing my undergraduate degree.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what are the sort of things you learned in that role and in being in that community?
Oh, yeah, that's wonderful. I learned I learned to put my self-confidence back together because it was pretty well destroyed, right? And, my sense of myself is to reestablish that I have something valuable, that I'm more than what I was made out to be, which was powerless, really. And I can help people. I can listen to people. I can interact with them. I did a lot of interacting with uh, the professional community around Halifax and the self-help community and the funding agencies, because I was all of those things. So I got to learn that I was pretty versatile. I could pretty well move around different um, I'll say organizations or collectives of people and kind of fit in. So that was valuable for me to be able to kind of feel like I'm expanding again. I'm expanding out in ways that was completely unfamiliar to me before because it was only military. Because Halifax is still a strange city to me at that point, right?
Okay.
It was just a posting, right?
Right. Yeah. So you gain back some self-confidence, sense of yourself, and the ability to move amongst these other communities. Were you drawn in at all by the individual nature as well, in terms of that one-on-one interaction with somebody?
Yes. What I learned there is yes. I mean, what I learned there is that I had the capacity to listen to people and put them at ease. And I also learned that, addiction always had this kind of weird, uh, basically that they're just worthless people. And these were people who had, they ended up on the streets in Halifax, but they were pilots. They were people who were professionals at one point in their lives, and they had common histories. And their common histories were developmental abuse, developmental neglect, dislocation. All of that was a common theme. So that was my first introduction, even before I had a name to it, to trauma and the legacies and the trajectories of trauma histories, right? And those lessons probably served me more than my formal academic education understanding when I come back to the military later, and in my professional life, those lessons really helped.
Yeah, that must have been a powerful sort of 1-2 punch. Is that you're getting educated. You said psychology, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and then you're having this hands-on experience at the same time. That must have been a really sort of great pairing.
Yes, it was. um, and Yeah, so I was a good student. And so that meant that even some of the things I was learning in school, and I'm experiencing it firsthand, going, that doesn't quite fit. That's not quite how it works, right?
Right.
And for the most part, the instructors and stuff were good about it. I didn't, make a big deal of it, but in knowing that, okay, there are some gaps here, what we know formally and what actually happens in people's lives, the actual histories, the actual lives they're trying to live.
So when you finished up at St. Mary's in your undergrad, what was the next thing?
So the next thing was briefly, I worked for a group of psychologists in Halifax as an honor student with sex offenders briefly. People who had, various offenses, federal offenses like molesting children or violent sexual acts and things like that. So that there I learned again that the histories, again, not taking anything away from the wrongness of their behaviors, But a lot of these folks, I ended up assessing them and doing what was termed fallometric testing, so very technical testing of them, see if, the kinds of things that they were sexually aroused to. But most of these, and these were all mostly men, most of these men had similar backgrounds, similar histories, just the early life, because we had to, pretty extensive assessments of them, pretty common histories, again, around abuses, neglect, violence, growing up in it, right? And again, it's not taking anything away from their behaviors. When the priests from Newfoundland started to come through that system, that's when I stopped work there. I couldn't do it anymore. We had a 3-year-old son at the time, and ironically, their attitude toward behavior with children just sent chills down my spine. They just didn't see anything wrong with it, right? And to me, it's like I can't be here, right?
Yeah, that's a good segue into my next question. So I was talking to a number of people that were working at a hospice the other day, and specifically one doctor, pretty much his entire practice, physician who is working palliative, and I asked him about, so how do you manage it? Like, how do you manage the daily interacting with people who are losing a loved one, interacting with someone who's on the verge of death, and how do you manage it? And it was a great conversation to get his sort of perspective on it. And I guess I asked you the same sort of thing, right? Is, how, and it's not specific to your last example here, but I'm just curious as to how you over the years have managed your own well-being when dealing with so many people who are dealing with trauma and so many sort of shocking aspects of society.
Hmm. My ways to stay, I'll use the word sane, because there's a lot of insanity that really occupies I'll use the word trauma space. The insane histories that people have to live, that just often don't get talked about fully when we focus on things like PTSD and things like that. My ways of doing it were always to write. I've always kept journals, and I write on everything I can find. It ended up being in books and poetry and songs. For years, I was a marathoner, so I would run. I would just run off the energy, because it wasn't the stories, Chris. The stories I could connect at a human level, right? So people is people. And that's always been my attitude. So I can connect and be with people. And what I've said to therapists I've supervised, my job is to be whatever they need me to be at the time, right? To help them do the work they need to do, right? And so I've not forgotten that. Now that eventually caught up with me when I end up kind of dealing with the bureaucracies of CF's medical system and VAC's medical system. Those things, that's the kinds of things that wore me out, not the stories, because the stories are about human beings hurting and looking for a different way out and wanting someone to be beside them and not judge them and not look down on them. Right? That's what they want. That's what they,
Yeah, it's what you said, John. What they need me to be. Um, I think that's a great piece of advice, and I just relate it back um, to parenting. And one of the things that I don't know where I read this, but it's something I've been trying to do as a parent, and my daughter's in university now, is understanding. So if she comes to me with something, it's sort of, I now bucket it into one of three things. Is she looking for me to help, to hear, or to hug? right? Do you want me to provide a solution? Because that would be my default.
Yep.
Always which is not helpful in a lot of cases, but I realize that about myself is that I will always look to help. But now I'm more mindful of, okay, does she just need someone to listen, right? A bit of a vent. She doesn't need it, or does she need someone to give her a hug and to provide that support beyond listening? And it's taken me a long time to get to that point of trying to understand what she needs from me at that moment. And I'm still working on it. So I think that's an amazing piece of advice. Now, when you left that last gig, what was the next step? Because you're now starting to get a pretty good diversity of experience. You worked at the halfway house. You've got your undergrad education. You've
Yep.
worked with federally convicted people with sexual issues, sexual crimes. So what was the next step?
The next step was pretty well off to Acadia for a master's degree in clinical and community psychology. And out of that, I had done a thesis looking at employee assistance programs. And so right out of my master's degree, I ended up as an EAP specialist with a company here in Halifax. Had done, my research around health professions and nursing and things like that. So, and my advisor at Acadia, Dr. Leiter, went on and kind of developed all of this, the instruments around burnout and things like that. I mean, a term that gets thrown around, but being part of that whole research agenda of looking at psychological burnout, what that means, different components. So, so that set me up for the EAP world, and I was there for a year and a half, a little over a year and a half. And so as a private company, the EAP world at that point, they would contract with different organizations, whether it's could be DFO, it could be different hospitals, it could be this. So they would sign a contract. And so I'm there as a psychologist, doing individual therapy work and assessment and things like that, part of this whole EAP world, and had found out that what he was doing was going into locked files and sharing details of private information basically back to managers, wanting to know, what's Bill there for, what's going on with Bill, right? And I found out, and I remember losing my cool, man. And I lost my cool in a big way. It ended up with me saying, if I find out you are doing this again, I will throw you through the goddamn window. And that pretty well ended our relationship, right? Because he wasn't about to stop. I tried making formal complaints, and I was told it was mine to resolve. Again, I'm back to this situation. Not doing this again. Mm-hmm. Something's wrong, and now I'm being put in a position to be powerless again. That ain't gonna wash, right? So I left there, and I thanked him later. I said, thank you for giving me the impetus to go on for my PhD program. And that was how that ended, right?
Right. Another sort of indication of a huge betrayal of trust.
Oh, man. Yeah, it was. Yeah, because I had been brought on with the plan that I would take over the company because he wasn't a professional, and they knew they needed to professionalize. What I didn't realize is that he was engineering a sellout to a company in Ontario, and it's now a huge name in Canada. But so those are the early days. But anyway, so you're right. It was here we go again, right? And part of it's like, geez, how did they end up here again? And maybe it's been too given. Well, no, I still want to give people the benefit of the doubt. But giving people the benefit of the doubt when they're bad actors can come back to bite you. That's what I learned.
Yeah, isn't that true? I mean, do you find that people in general default to giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when all objective information tells them they shouldn't? Is that a human nature thing, you think?
Well, for some it is. It certainly is for me. I wouldn't say there are people who are paranoid and cynical, but that's their default. Everything is suspicious. Everything can't be trusted. And I think at some point, maybe it's, I don't know. I'm not going to say it's a naivety, or maybe it's a hopefulness. Yeah, I would say more a hopefulness. I want to be able to see the best in people. I don't want to live the other way, right?
Yeah.
So at some level, maybe it's a choice, and history certainly has. Our histories have something to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm hopeful in that way. I always like to think that people's actions, the things that they do that I don't agree with, I try and frame it that there's some reason that they're doing this. They don't genuinely understand how this is hurtful, how this is counterproductive. Yeah, and maybe I'm naive, but I agree with you. I don't want to live the other way, just walking around being angry and cynical about everything in life.
No.
That's no way to live. So PhD, what was your PhD focused on, and where'd you do it?
Well, my PhD, now this ends up, okay. So my PhD is clinical psychology at UNB. So I'm on campus. I'm doing my courses and all those things. And I get a call from CFB Stadacona, Halifax. We've have a position coming. Would you be interested? And I went, oh boy. So, and these were friends I'd known years ago, one friend in particular. And I said, okay, sure, I'll come down for an interview. So I remember coming down. I remember the first time I walked on base, Chris, I was literally shaking in my vehicle, going back to the main gate with the base chief's office right there. I might as well still be wearing a uniform, right? It was just, so I get through the main gate and I go for the interview. And of course, I'm given the position. So here I am again. I'm employed at STAD. I've done the on-campus, because I'm going to UNB Fredericton at the time, on campus. So I work out that my coursing can be done distance now, because my PhD dissertation work could be done on my own. Some research could be done on my own. So I could work and also complete my PhD. And my classmates at UNB said, "Jesus, man, you were here 1 minute and gone the next, and you had a PhD." Right? They didn't realize that because I also needed work. I mean, everything up to this point now is heavily relying on my wife's work, right? While I'm gallivanting off to universities. Right. So it was important for me to be contributing. So I ended up as an addictions counselor for like a minute. And then I ended up being the director pretty soon, like even before I finished off my PhD.
And how was that experience?
It was great. So, so my PhD dissertation was looking at treatment outcomes for Canadian Forces members, and what I was looking at was the mental health component to addiction within the military. Of course, a lot of the things you and I have talked about are still pretty common. A lot of developmental histories, a lot of stuff that, oh God, horrendous stuff that people were putting up with in their sections and within the system and itself. Just who wouldn't drink, right? That's why, So end up doing a lot of things at STAT at the time, because the management of personal information, the way assessments weren't being done, it was pretty lax. So I really endeavored on putting structures in place, assessment process in place, confidentiality and privacy in place, ethics in place. So for me, I took that on, that needed to be put in place, right? Now here's when I start to run into kids who were experiencing the same kinds of things that I did. That became the hook, and now I was angry again. But now I'm an angry PhD psychologist with the power to do things. So that meant calling up COs and threatening to go to the media. That meant making pretty formal accusations within the system. And that meant advising kids to get lawyers, to file formal grievances, to file formal complaints, to get out, to protect themselves. So that was me at Stadacona, right, in the early days. And then we came fully under medical services, and this was around the time that the PTSD world, the term I use, when the PTSD empire was erected, right? And then I knew, for me to do the kind of work that I wanted to do, which was looking at the overlaps between moral injury, developmental histories, PTSD, would never be able to be entertained within the system the way it was going.
Now, were there any, I've got a couple questions. So I've always been curious, is if we had better screening before people entered the military, what do you think that would do? Would that have a significant impact on, I guess, the number of people who are dealing with trauma, who are maybe not, the organization is not the right organization for them? I'm wondering if that would help at all. And then the other one being inside the organization, if there was common sort of threads or themes around actions to the chain of command that you saw that were incredibly unhelpful.
Yes. Okay. Two questions, and you're not saying this, so I'll say that right up front. So the first becomes part of the spoiled goods argument, right? Which is, well, there were broken people before they came here anyway. So now what we do know, the latest research in Canada, is that anywhere from, let's say, 45 to 50% of people who end up in the military have histories of developmental abuse, ACEs, adverse childhood, challenged childhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not to say that all of those people end up with mental health problems or PTSD in the military. They don't, right? So we know that. So it's not so much that that they shouldn't be screened or enrolled in the military. What it does mean is that people who come from those backgrounds are more sensitized to things like betrayal. They're going to react more strongly because now I chose this system. Now they're betraying me. Now I'm being harassed and bullied like I was before, and right. So it ends up being a replay for them. So the other part to that is, I know the toughest soldiers I know, the best soldiers I know, and I know a lot of them. They come from some pretty tough backgrounds. They did wonderfully in the military. They excelled in the military. So the history itself doesn't dictate how they're going to respond. They're more sensitive to pick up on, a leader not doing their jobs, what's right and wrong, especially sensitive to betrayal. So it's more like, unless the military is going to come up with an entirely different recruiting pool, which I doubt, it means that the organization puts the onus on the organization. Maybe we better stand by what we say. Maybe we better do competent leadership. Maybe we better stop, this whole agenda, hide bad news, hide the secrets, keep it to yourself, stuff it away, NDAs, that whole world. Stop creating pressure cookers for people where they have venues to have their say about the stuff they're experiencing and witnessing, right? When Chris Sutherland was here in Halifax, I had conversations, about wouldn't it be great if we could create forums for people where they can go, no names, no pack drill, where they can just come and say whatever's going on without retribution or recrimination or being singled out afterward. It's the silence that kills people. It's the silence about things that can't be said that drives people crazy, right? The stuff that we pack away because we're trained to pack it away, and there's no out for it until people start to explode and go off the rails, and then everybody's surprised. but nobody wants to know the story. What's your story? When we deal into the stories of the PTSD stories, there's a lot much, and I've treated, diagnosed members individually and groups over the years. There is a whole story to the PTSD story that is never heard. It's the stuff that happens beforehand. It's the stuff that happens to people afterwards, especially afterwards, that just doesn't ever get talked about because we're so focused on that quote medical condition. And I have a lot of difficulty with the medicalizing mental health issues anyway.
It's a really useful sort of roll up, John, because I don't think I'd ever heard it sort of broken down that way in terms of the screening or the screening coming in portion, the percentages, and as you so rightly point out, it never absolves the institution, the chain of command from doing the right thing. Never. So there's certain things that are immutable, and then there's all the other bits and pieces that move around it. So I appreciate that sort of your perspective and rolling that up. So you're working at STAD, and how long did you sort of work inside the forces then in that role?
So I was there from 97 up until 2005, and at that point, DND and Veterans Affairs had put out a national request for proposal to develop a joint addictions and PTSD programs. So I teamed up with a group on the West Coast, and we put in a proposal. And so I was given the nod to set up an Atlantic kind of clinic to treat what was termed comorbid disorders. And so that was my I was already leaving STAD anyway, but that was my legitimate way out, if you will. Still working with the system, but outside the system. So I established a clinic, hired psychologists, and set up a shop in Dartmouth, which is across from Halifax, and saw a lot of people. The group program itself took a while to get off the ground because, like every new initiative, it's great on paper, but who does the work of referrals and all of that? That was up to us. So it took a while for us to figure that out, that, oh, no, you've got to get your own referrals. We have the program. We're not going to refer to you. It's like, oh, okay. So, but we did. I mean, we got quite busy quite fast, and we were seeing a lot of the Afghan guys, right? And mostly guys. Some of the stuff we'd already talked about, just the things that they've seen, witnessed, experienced, and the issues they have with the military medical system and just being kind of booted off the base and go see these other people. Not all of them, a fair percentage had addiction issues because that's what I was known for at the time. But again, it was the themes were pretty common, right? So I ended up running the group program for Veterans Affairs, sponsored it from 2005 up until 2015, so for 10 years. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they just stopped paying. They stopped paying the bill. Like,
right.
Oh, okay, I guess it's over, right?
Problem's gone away, so we just stopped paying the bill.
Yeah. So so here's the deal. We had taken the people, and again, just not to put us on any pedestals, the people. We had taken the clients, the military people that everybody else had thrown away, that they'll never get better, that they're just trouble. And they had done exceptionally well because what we did is what we developed is put veterans together with veterans and let them tell their full story in a way that was safe, and they held each other accountable, and they held each other they held each other as mostly men, right? A lot of vulgarity, a lot of profanity, lots of laughing, and then lots of tears, man. I mean, these are guys who could walk through walls, right? And I got to see the men who are struggling to be men. In a lot of cases, I got to see the little boys right?
Mm.
Anyway, and that's my hook to that work, right? Is people just trying to find a place to come home and not be saddled with all this stuff that tells them that their brains are fried and all that kind of stuff. I think we have to find ways to help people remember that they're more than what they were in uniform, and they can do that with some dignity. They can do that in ways that other people can understand it and help them kind of hit the ground again, right? When we talk about coming back to community, I mean, the title of your podcast, coming back to their families as functioning, contributing people, not these damaged goods, right? That takes work, and it takes much more than a medical diagnosis, or meds, or cannabis, or ketamine, or psilocybin. Man, it takes a lot, right, to come back as a functioning human being.
Yeah, purpose is so important, and storytelling. I mean, there's a bunch of things that come out of that, John. So these men sitting around sharing stories with one another is really powerful. I know that it is not uncommon for me to end up having a conversation with a veteran about transition. People sort of thanking me for, I wrote 3 articles on my transition, sort of when I left, a year in and 2 years in. And my point to them was, I'm just writing down what I did. I mean, just sharing is really important. And I understand that some people aren't in a place to be able to necessarily share. But I think those that are really need to. They don't think there's any value in it. It's kind of like this podcast, actually. I would say that almost every guest I've ever interviewed says, my story is not interesting. I'm not sure what people are going to take away from it. And I get multiple comments on every guest about an aspect of that conversation, about a part of their life, about something that has spoken to somebody else and been useful. And I really wish that people would find a way to share their stories. Veterans would find a way to share their stories more, because it's always helpful. And then the other part of that is the purpose part, and that's trickier, because my sense is, at least in my journey, I had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out who I am, what's important to me in this part of my life, to be able to figure out the things that give me purpose beyond family and friends. And it's not easy. And I'm not sure that in the military's ever done a good job of doing that beyond the institution as your purpose. Because when the institution, when you leave or it leaves you, whichever happens or however you view it, what do you do then? When you haven't, it's not a really healthy environment to be where that sort of thinking is necessarily proactive or encouraged. And the example I'll give, it's from a friend who actually lives in Halifax, a guy named Phil Jewell, who we used to work together, and he started in the British Army. And Phil told me that when he was attending Sandhurst, first day, Sandhurst, he's on parade, and the commandant of Sandhurst stands up and is saying, welcome. And as much as he is welcoming them into the military, he is saying, and I'm expecting all of you to be thinking about what happens when you leave the military. I think that's a completely different mindset, for sure, is this is going to end someday, and you need to understand what your life is going to look like after you leave.
Yeah, very, very different. Absolutely different. Yeah, no, at one end, I can understand the military needs us to be focused for its purpose, operations, what's asked of them by the government. So to stay focused on this job at hand, it's not something I've heard people say. Now, I know, there are efforts around changing military culture right now, but this idea that we're only going to have you for a short period of time and we're worried, no, we want you to excel beyond us. And those are conversations I've never heard repeated to me that they've ever heard.
Yeah, it's so true, and it's almost like this is probably a poor analogy, but it's like the omerta sort of with the mafia, that you never speak about certain things, and I found that was the case in uniform, is that it was like you don't speak about leaving, you don't speak about what you would do afterwards. And maybe this is antiquated from when I was a young officer, but I mean, if you're speaking about doing something else, then you're not fully committed. You're not dedicated, which of course is complete nonsense. And everybody knows it's complete nonsense, but for whatever reason, leaving is not viewed as a good thing. I mean, I always tried to have the opinion, especially as I got more senior in rank, is that you get a young fellow come into your office who's going to be leaving after 3 years, and almost apologetic sometimes, and you say, "Why are you apologizing? You want to go and do education, you want to do this, you want to do that." You realize that having served full-time 3 years for your country is probably more than most citizens will ever do in their life. That's something to be proud of. So be proud of it. And you want them to, like any employer, you want them to leave singing the praises of that organization. They're going to be the best representatives, without a doubt. So, yeah, I mean, notwithstanding all of the talk about culture change and the like in the military, I think there's some aspects of it that are just far simpler, that can be boiled down to just, listen to people, understand what they need, support them, and be honest with them. Because sometimes what you need, you can't get in the military. And you need to be honest about that it's not the spot where, if you're at a stage in your life, you need A, B, or C, well, maybe you just can't get that in the military. And that's okay. Then go find it somewhere else. But as you and I have both experienced, false promises help nobody.
No.
At all.
It breeds something in the veteran community that does not help the military. Because let's face it, like it or not, the veterans in Canada right now, a lot of them are pretty upset dudes and women, right? They are not extolling the virtues of the Canadian Armed Forces to anybody.
So I'm curious, how did I want to understand sort of what you're doing now, but I also want to sort of understand, how did you get involved with Camp Aftermath? How did that connection get met?
Yeah, so I'm an adjunct prof at Mount St. Vincent. So I have done research, continue to do research, continue to do activities. Well, at this point in my life, putting my energy where it can have some impact, and not kind of running into cement walls as much, hard on the head. So I ran into Farid through a colleague at Mount St. Vincent. This guy reaching out, wanted to do this program with veterans. He wanted to kind of take them on a different experience, volunteerism and things like that. So I've gotten used to risk, so I met him in Toronto at one of the CIMBAR, the Canadian Institute of Military Health Research forums, and he came, we talked, and we had long conversations, and I liked the idea, and the idea of being able to introduce veterans to a different aspect of themselves, of helping other people without a uniform. Right, as a way of coming back to community. So that was the hook. So Farid and I had a lot of conversations around that, and so I'd already done a lot of group work and a lot of group work training. So my job is really to put these safety parameters in place so people didn't get hurt, whether it was here in Canada or in those days Costa Rica, and they did wonderfully with the program. So. And Farid had already approached a number of people who told him it was too dangerous, silly idea. So, and again, being a bit of a rebel, I do what's necessary, right? And so, so that was the energy, Chris, that I brought to that, because I saw it as a way of, we got to get out from under this suffocating medical umbrella. That the best we can do for people with PTSD is manage symptoms, and that they can never move on in their life. And I've never believed that, and I still don't believe that, because I've seen people move beyond and become different versions of themselves when provided the opportunity and the support and the challenge, right? And so that was my hook into Camp Aftermath. Right now, we've just in December we piloted a program in Berlin for Ukrainian medical folks, and wonderful experience. Just saw the feedback this morning. Some of the same ingredients that we work with our folks with, they still work with medical people from a different country, because we provide safety, we're not medicalizing, and we're meeting people as people. And with an interpreter in this case, right?
Right.
So continue to do that kind of work, because I see the value. To me, group is a metaphor for family. What most people end up doing, unfortunately, when they have mental health concerns, is they withdraw into isolation and shame and self recrimination, and don't realize that what they're experiencing is a shared experience with other people, and that there's a way forward, right? Without putting a label on it necessarily.
Yeah. Can you expand upon, you've made this point one or two times already, medicalizing. Can you expand a little bit on that term and as it relates to this subject?
Yeah, so I'll use two terms. So when PTSD, really post-traumatic stress disorder, really hit Canada, it was on the books, of course, out of the Vietnam experience in the States. In around 2001, we had psychiatrists, academics come from the States teaching us about what was wrong with people's brains with PTSD, that they had altered brains. So out of that came this whole idea that PTSD is really like a brain injury, that there are different brain areas that are damaged. There are different processes in the brain that are damaged. And so it meets a specific set of criteria with cutoffs. You either meet like hyperarousal or or mood disorders and things like that meet certain criteria, and we can fit it in a medical diagnosis. And a medical diagnosis says we have prescripted treatments for it, medications, individual talk therapies. They become the solution to this medical disorder. Problem with the PTSD construct, if you will, I use that word construct, is that no brain area has ever been identified as a cause for PTSD. But the medical narrative that it is a medical condition that needs to be managed in private, and the best you can do is manage symptoms, persists. And it's a pretty ingrained phenomena at this point. The problem with that, of course, is that when we look at the other aspect, which is the moral injury part, moral injury is being seen as more of that's just a perception problem. That's just because you're really not strong enough or have enough emotional fortitude. It's more of a separate issue. It's not really a medical issue, and I'm not arguing that either of them should be medicalized. But it places the moral injury and the influence of betrayals, bullying, harassment on a lower priority in terms of contributing to or causing the problem. Because most of the people I've seen with PTSD, diagnosed with PTSD, almost without exception, Chris, there is a strong moral component to it. I've seen very few where it's a discrete kind of something happened, I was overwhelmed, I got afraid, and I don't know what to do with the fear. That those cases are so minute. The percentages are so small that it's in my world at least, it doesn't even register. So medicalizing means really just putting it in a medical category. Medical people are the only ones who can diagnose it and treat it in a prescriptive kind of way, even though we still have not identified causation. And that is fundamental to medical diagnoses, like cancer or a broken bone, right? Yeah. So hopefully I haven't confused that part of the conversation.
No, I don't think so. And I'm curious. So, what would be an example of a better model then if you've got somebody who is dealing with PTSD? What would the variety of modalities look like you think that would be more appropriate for helping them?
So right now it's medication first, and we've seen there are all kinds of issues with medications. They have some pretty nasty side effects. They kind of numb people out, right? They don't really change anything in the brain. So going medication first. I mean, there's been some changes in that. A lot of veterans, as you know, have said, no more meds. I'm going to move to other things, more exotic drugs or marijuana. Of course, those do the same kinds of issues. So, and the other option, of course, is individual therapy, where you go and you talk to a private therapist, a psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker, and what's said in those sessions is never repeated outside, right? So, what under the medical umbrella is very contained, very private, but the broader conversation of actually what happens is happening to people is never talked about anywhere. People are advised, don't talk about what goes on in your sessions outside your session. So all that to say, we need forums for a much broader conversations where everything that's going on in the person's experience can be talked about, including the critical incidents, the big bang incidents, because they happen within a context. So the groups I'm still doing, that's my focus. It's not about managing symptoms or getting the labels exactly right. It's about providing a safe forum for people where they can talk about the full story without being judged or ridiculed or told they're crazy, and being held accountable to goals that they make, and being held accountable by other veterans who know the experience, right? It is something to look across the room in somebody else's eyes and know by the look in their eyes, they get it. Nothing against civilian psychologists, civilian therapists. They don't get it. How can they? They're coming from schools with pretty prescriptive models that don't fit. They know that. They try to amend it. They try to work around it. But the whole issue around privacy, confidentiality, these days I question who that ultimately serves, right? May serve the veteran, I don't know, right? That their privacy is protected. But it also protects the system, because moral injury, abuses, neglects, harassment, operationally things that happen under orders that shouldn't have happened. Well, if those are outside a private forum, it's potentially embarrassing to the Canadian Forces. It could and would end careers. We don't want that out. So I'm concerned that the privacy part of medical diagnosis, medical treatment, the intended or unintended, is to keep the secrets secret. Thank you very much, because everybody's happy. The veteran they get supports from Veterans Affairs, they get monies, they get supports, they may get some educational things like that. But these other uncomfortable stories don't hit the airways. They don't, right? And I think that's unfortunate, because, as I've said, as veterans, we have a lot more in common than we do differences, no matter where we've served, what era. Some things are pretty common throughout the experience that keep showing themselves over and over and over, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a long answer.
No, that's great. I love long answers. So I got two questions about to get your advice on some things. So the first one is about transition out of the military. And it'd be great to hear if you have any advice for those serving to prepare themselves for leaving the military. And I think this is regardless of if you're ill and injured or if you feel that you're leaving unencumbered by anything, whatever. Is there any advice that you would tell somebody serving right now that they should be doing to help themselves with a healthy transition?
One of the first things, and I heard this from a U.S., her name is Jenny Honeycutt, and she and I have conversations. We get handed the word veteran even before we take the uniform off. It's a meaningless term. Veteran is something, it's an emerging identity that we develop over time. So it's not like all of a sudden we are the person we're going to be, let's say, a week after taking the uniform off and 3 or 5 years down the road. It's going to change over time. And so what would I suggest for people? One of the things we don't do well, and maybe it's changed, we were trained, civilian culture, I have nothing in common with you. I am better than you. You are nothing compared to me. So we sever our connections with the civilian communities we live in. So what I would say is, throughout your career, unless you're deployed, make efforts to stay connected with your community. Volunteer. Be the sports dad, man, that shows up to help coach, whatever. Be involved in different communities, organizations. Don't just be content like that. My military identity is all of it, right? So, and there's some research around it as well saying, no, you need to continually keep that civilian world on your radar. So when we talk about transitioning out, we're not transitioning out into this great unknown. We already have established connections and relationships. These days, as you said earlier, there's a lot of information available about what am I going to do next, right? Even before, like I would say, the 3 years before you're taking the uniform off, start putting steps in place. Am I going to go back to schooling? Am I going to try a different career? Start taking the coursing that kind of connects you with that next phase. Now, you may change it after you get out and go, I really don't want to sell real estate. I want to do something else, right? But make those steps, because really on that, this is taking a normal trajectory. Like, you've got a window, you're leaving. The system knows you're leaving, right? Is to put those tangible steps in place. One of the things that really doesn't get talked about much is repair the damage done to your family because of deployments. Because it's not going to get better just because you leave. Those wounds, if they're not addressed, man, they will show themselves pretty fast. Once you're around, quote, around the house a lot, right? That those things will they need to be repaired. So be willing to step up to that, right? The separations, the things, the attitudes we have while we're doing our thing, right? So those would be some things I would say. Establish it. I mean, my son does this, and he lives in Montreal. Establish yourself a group. He's in a men's group, but some forum where you can just talk as a person, right? However that translates. Stop the isolation thing, man. It's like this whole self-reliant, I've got all the answers, I don't need anybody, and I'm all that. Well, the truth is, nobody is. You weren't before, and certainly not going to be afterward, right?
So on the same theme of advice, what advice would you have for the chain of command based on all the interactions that you've had with veterans? Advice from the chain of command about what right looks like in terms of making sure that they are fulfilling their responsibilities. And my sense is that sometimes people make decisions or they act in certain ways and they have no idea of the actual impacts of people. for whatever reason. So perhaps through your experience in working with veterans, there's a few things that you've seen that you say, I really wish the chain of command would stop doing this. It's a simple thing. Stop doing this. It's going to have a huge impact on people's lives and well-being.
Yeah. The immediate thing that comes to my mind, one of the things I asked years ago, and again, I don't mean just gender this because it applies to senior female officers as well. Where have all the men gone, right? And by that, I mean, be willing to sit down and listen and take seriously the uncomfortable stories you don't want to hear because it rubs your shiny brass too much, right? Be willing to hear the uncomfortable conversations even right from your lowest members, because ultimately most of those, if listened to and taken seriously, are for the benefit of the Canadian Armed Forces. If they could just hear that and not take it as a personal affront, or I'm not going to get promoted, or this is going to look like a black mark on me, get your ego out of the way and actually put the organization first. And the organization means listen to your people, right? Listen to them, right? And stop this lip service stuff, right? Or, well, that's fair enough. We're not going to have this conversation anymore. Or policy XYZ says this. Like, come on, man. Like, Jesus, come on, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would say. Stop being politicians in uniform.
So if you sit down and you listen and you hear people's concerns, what does a healthy response look like? And I'll pick up on something you said about this, John. So if something is really pissing somebody off, and I will certainly own this of using this exact response, is listening and then saying, like, I don't know how to solve this problem because of a policy or the authorities I do or do not have, which is really a hollow answer. And I've probably said that countless times in my career. If this is not going to make you feel any better, this is what I know, and this is why I think the situation is the way it is. I mean, what would a better answer for me to have given to people in that situation when they bring a problem to me?
So people appreciate honesty even more than they may admit at the time. They may still be pissed off, but to give them an honest answer, like, this is the situation. My hands are tied. I cannot do anything about this, but I hear it, right? So, I mean, sometimes that is the reality, but in other cases, it's not, because policies are, as you know, policies are movable, bendable, right? Exceptions are made all the time, right? It's being willing, if there's room for the exception. Now, people are also mindful of their own careers, right? We don't want to step out and get a black mark on ourselves, right? So it's being willing to take the risk on behalf of something that you believe is a legitimate complaint, one. And even second, like, okay, maybe I can't do anything about it, but I will push it wherever that means. I'll push it where it needs to be pushed in the system. I'll bring it to the CDS's attention, whatever it is, right? So at least as a leader, I've taken my step on their behalf. And whether you notify the member or not, that would probably be important. But so people know that, okay, I know where the lines are. I know what can and can't be done. I know that this person has integrity, and I know that they'll try to do something about it if it's that serious, that they'll take some action step, right? Versus just that's the way it is, right? I've got 2 minutes, get out of my office, right?
So, John, I think before we wrap things up today, I mean, the last thing I'd be interested to hear is any of your thoughts back again on the transition piece. I mean, I asked you a specific question about advice, but it's a huge issue in the veteran community, and one that I probably end up speaking about with veterans the majority of the time. So I'd like to get your thoughts on transition just in general for those who are serving, or even those who are not serving anymore and still sort of grappling with transition.
When we talk about transition, we're not quite sure what transition means, right? For some people, it turns out to be, is it about managing their symptoms? Is it about getting a job? Is it about getting back to school? Now, the people who are also transitioning out of the military, especially medically, they're also tied up in the Veterans Affairs system, whether it's the voc rehab program or whether it's, individual entitlement for sessions. So what does transition look like for them? Does it mean that they stay in therapy forever? Does it mean that they, go along with the rehab program, which doesn't have a lot of details or components in it? They're trying to put some some substance within that umbrella term. But what gets missed in transition is that the issue you and I have been talking about is we have to somehow come up with a new identity for ourselves. We have to realize we are giving up, relinquishing an identity that has served us. And there's a spot in there where it's a no man's land. I am not this thing I was. Right? I'm not the special forces guy. I'm not the super Navy tech anymore. I am, what am I? Right? And so that's a spot that we have to manage quite carefully, like within the first couple of years, like when you realize I've got to start in essence from scratch, if you will, to develop this new version of myself that I have no idea where it's coming from, or pardon me, going to. I may have to give up some of the values that I have lived by from the military forever. In my case, type A, perfectionistic, hyper-focused, right? Over-disciplined. I had to chill out, right? And the chilling out took me more than a few years. That chilling out took me decades. And it wasn't until my daughter said, Daddy, why are you so angry all the time? I didn't even realize it. That's the way you approach the world. To get things done, you push, right? So that's also a part of this, quote, transition, right? Transition from something to something else. We don't know what the something else is, man. And that's what makes it rough. We don't know what the something else is.
That's a great way to sort of wrap this conversation, John. Thanks so much for taking the time today. This has been really informative and a lot of fun. And I really appreciate you sharing not only your story, but providing a voice to so many veterans that you've worked with over the years. I think it's absolutely critical. So appreciate you being on the show, and thanks for being another one of our Northern Sentinels.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with John. Please subscribe to The Greater Good on Substack to get this and other content to help you citizen better. Thanks for listening, and goodbye till next time.